Hey folks, thanks for coming out today. We're going to spend a little bit of time in this lecture talking about realism and liberalism, quite obviously. And our goals are to A, consider the historical roots and trajectories of realism and liberalism. We're going to do a little bit of background and history here. Two, understand why these theories, despite their differences, might actually be fairly similar. Realism and liberalism are kind of like the competing twins or dyads of political science, international relations, and global theories of political science more broadly. They get endless attention in textbooks, in theoretical debates, occasional journal articles, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to suggest, and this is very much my argument, I want to make this really clear, is that actually they might not be that different from each other. And I'm going to explain some of the ways in which I see this and some of the arguments I'm making in the context of this class. And we're going to talk very briefly towards the end about how they reinforce or challenge the idea of the state under globalization. This is one of the main themes. Basically, we inherited, as people living in the 21st century, we've inherited all this thinking about the state, about politics, about political authority. How has it weathered exactly in the first 20-ish years of the 21st century? How has this really held up? And so these are some of the questions I want to provoke and I want to sort of start talking about in this module of the class more broadly. So, starting off with realism. Ideas about realism are often the sort of canon of international relations thinking. They take shape in the Cold War US, drawing from debates in German political thought before World War II. There's this long and fairly complex intellectual heritage of realism in older schools of German geopolitics. We're not going to get there in this class. I dig into this in some of my advanced level classes, and I know other folks do as well. For now, this is just what I need you to know. Number two, realism is at once a theory of how things are and of how people ought to act. Realism wants to be a tough-minded theory about the reality of the world, yet it also implies that people really both will and ought to act in certain ways to validate the theory. For realists, interests or survival of a state dictates its outward orientation. I've changed the color on that particular point because we're going to contrast it with liberalism just in a few minutes. Lineage of realism goes back at least to the Peace of Westphalia, although as we're going to see in a couple of slides, actually oftentimes far older thinkers and far older bodies of political thought get invoked or get drawn upon when talking about realism. And indeed, you have a few examples right here. There is this body of historical work in realist political thought that points to, Thucydides, Hobbes, Machiavelli, and a whole series of other thinkers who, themselves would never have identified as realist. I mean, if you asked Machiavelli if he was a realist or Hobbes if they were a realist, I'm not sure what they would have made of that question. But more importantly, would never have identified themselves as part of a single tradition or a single way of thinking about the world. So it's a composite act to basically bring all of these things together and to say they reflect a way of thinking or a set of ways of thinking that we can trace from thousands of years ago all the way up into the present day. One of the basic arguments of realism, and I'm going to start off with that block of text over there on the right of the screen for you guys, and then explain some of the concepts that are bullet pointed on the left. Realists are skeptical of universal moral principles. The argument is that these have to be filtered through circumstances of time and place. That sounds reasonable, and many people would argue that morals ought to be filtered or ought to be mediated by particular contextual circumstances. But in practice, for realist thinkers, what this has meant is that the state itself is not both a and really the only moral force that counts for anything. And this is really important. In realist thinking, the idea of community, the idea of neighborhood, the idea of subnational association like political parties and unions and stuff like this don't really matter very much. What matters is the state and the way the state acts as a moral person in international affairs. Now, depending on whose form of realism we follow, and as your textbook makes plain, there are a bunch of them out there, moral claims and aspirations are basically interests and can only be understood through the language of power. What does that mean? In other words, anytime people claim things, whenever people make claims on the basis of a shared morality or something like this is basically an expression of interests. The only way the interests are meaningful is when they're expressed in relation to power, and unsurprisingly, some people get their interests better represented than others do, and some states get their interests better represented than others do. Last but not least, while realists acknowledge that there do exist rules out there, I mean, they're not a bunch of people. I don't want to give you guys the wrong impression here. It's not like a bunch of people trying to recreate Lord of the Flies or anything. Ultimately, the anarchy of the sovereign state system is a constant feature in modern realist thought. What that means is that ultimately, the inability to ever do anything about the condition of anarchy, about the lack of rules in the international system, becomes a defining feature of realist thinking. So, what kinds of categories, what kinds of issues does this bring about? I'll give you a few examples here. The concepts of statism, survival, and self-help. The state comes first. Survival is the underlying interest of all. States have to take care of their own affairs because they can never rely on collective security, on help from others, and so forth. Distinction between high politics and low politics. Politics of the state are high politics, and that's where the action is. Low politics are not really all that interesting or consequential. 3. The notion of the national interest as the paramount interest that defines international politics for all intents and purposes. Your textbook talks a little bit about raison d'etat, or the reason of state, the idea being that ultimately one needs no other reason in international affairs to do X other than the interests or the reason of state. Collaboration, cooperation, etc. are nice. Like I said, realists are not pretending that there is no free trade or that everybody's constantly fighting everybody else. But these really work when the stakes are low, they argue. Unsurprisingly, I'm giving you a little bit of a really quick and dirty vision of what realism is all about here. Unsurprisingly, there are disputes within realism. Everybody that calls himself a realist, doesn't agree with everybody else who calls himself the same thing. So there is an older tradition of realism, Hobbes, Machiavelli, Thucydides, that people are avaricious, nasty, and greedy by nature, and ultimately, excuse me, being so, need power and authority to tame them or to control them or to control their behavior, or it will be anarchy out there. For Hobbes specifically, this power, this authority, will lay in the concept of the Leviathan, or the all-powerful state. The idea being that while you could not have a state at a global level, you could not have a global government, you could indeed have piecemeal, smaller chunks of authority that would bring people's nasty sort of tendencies into line. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it is not nature but anarchy that leads to conflict. In other words, people could be very well could be nice and pleasant and so on and so forth, but ultimately it's the state, the structure of anarchy that leads to conflict and that makes a realist concept of international relations necessary. Morgenthau, interests are defined in terms of power. In other words, and we talked a little bit about this notion before, those that have the most powerful voices tend to get what they want because they are able to define their interests as being the most important ones or as being the dominant ones. Structural realism, which your text talks about a little bit as well, kind of argues a little bit differently, which is the idea that, yeah, there are structures out there that limit people's actions. But at the same time, in concrete circumstances, just like I was saying, people will prioritize the national interest, and that's the only way we can understand action, or for that matter, inaction. And the classic example of this is the example of the genocide in Rwanda, where we have a situation where states are cognizant or aware of what is going on, that there are very, very bad conditions brewing on the ground, that large-scale human rights violations and indeed ultimately genocide are a possibility, but that ultimately the major powers, the most powerful states, choose not to get involved because it's not really in their interest to do so. Rwanda is a poor country, has no oil, is not part of anybody's critical strategic alliance, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in discussion papers about Rwanda, there was active awareness of the fact that they calling the conditions on the ground genocide might commit the U.S. to actually do something. And of course, the implication being that the U.S. didn't really want to do anything, not because they wanted to see a genocide take place, but because policymakers didn't see this as being in their interests. There are lots of other examples, not all of which are so gruesome and so horrifying. But the underlying claims here are pretty straightforward. Once you have put the national interest and this idea that a country can indeed have a defined set of national interests at the center of your view of the world, everything becomes a national interest question. Is it in our interest to act or is it not? And from there, we get a whole series of ways of thinking, a whole policy language, and a whole series of ways of thinking about the world around us that sort of follow from those underlying commitments. Liberalism is a little bit different in that it's an offshoot of Enlightenment theories of human perfectibility and scientific reason. A couple of quotations there from Descartes and Immanuel Kant. The idea being that actually there is something improvable, if not perfectible, about human beings, human society, through the application of science, technology, reflection, and so on and so forth. Like realism, liberals kind of pick up higgledy-piggledy everywhere from different texts and from different strands of thinking in the past, and liberalism kind of brings them all together into a single tradition. Like realism, modern liberalism takes shape more recently in the 19th and 20th century, with multiple strands of thought. Unsurprisingly, I mean, this is the time when universities start to divide into fields of study like political science and sociology and anthropology. And so this is when theoretical traditions as a whole tend to get their name and tend to get their identity. For liberals, the identity of a state determines its outward orientation. So remember the claim from realism a few slides ago. For liberals, this is obviously very different. At the same time, as we're going to see, what liberals mean by the identity of a state in some ways might be a little bit different from what we might have in mind hearing that phrase, and we're going to come back to that idea. You have four key ideas of liberalism on the left-hand side of the text over there that are drawn from your readings. And there are a series of key ideas that come from liberal political thinking that I want you to be familiar with. One, the notion of self-determination. The idea that states have a right to determine their own fate and their own future through democratic means. Two, the idea of free trade, but even more than that, the idea that freedom equals economic freedom. This is actually going to be really important. Liberals classically argue that people's freedom cannot really be expressed in an unfree market, even if they have other kinds of autonomy or other kinds of freedom. Two, citizenship and rights as a bulwark against conflict. So as your text points out, on the realist side, they tend to see things like the balance of power and mutually assured destruction as bulwarks against conflict. Liberals say, actually, we can use democracy, citizenship, rights as a bulwark, as protection against conflict, hence the concept of the democratic peace, which again your book talks about a little bit. Last but certainly not least, liberals believe in the possibilities of collective security. In other words, no, there might not be a global government, there might not be literally a single parliament for the world as a whole, but yes, it is possible, under specific material conditions, to collectivize security as a common good for multiple parties and multiple countries. And in fact, this strand, just on that side of the slide over there, this strand of liberal thinking with regards to the democratic peace and collective security is probably the most visible strand and probably the one that gets the most attention. So just to give you a few examples, like I gave you an example of realism before, a few cases of collective security. Now, I'm not trying to say necessarily these were all successful or all unsuccessful. The situation was unsurprisingly pretty complicated in all cases. But in Iraq in 1990, 1991, the Persian Gulf War is often held up as an example of liberal norms bringing a bunch of countries together in a coalition to accomplish a goal, in this case, getting Iraq out of Kuwait. In the former Yugoslavia, the Dayton Peace Accords of 1995 were seen as another example of liberal norms of collective security bringing a war to an end. Now, of course, critics will say, actually, it was a bit more complicated than that, and it was a bit more complicated than that, but the point I'm trying to make simply, liberal norms and liberal ideas were very much at stake in these issues. Other less known examples, the UN peacekeeping forces and the OSCE peacekeeping force in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is just on the bottom, that image on the bottom left of your slide. It's a disputed territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And the UN force in East Timor, Timor-Leste. Less well-known examples, but still really useful examples for thinking about the concept of collective security and how, at the end of the day, it can, one might argue, provide some positive outcomes in terms of more security and less conflict. More generally, though, most of the major institutions we have in the post-World War II world, and even starting from the post-World War I world, were more or less based on liberal principles. It's kind of tough to talk about the European Union or the IMF or the World Bank without talking about liberalism in some or other form and without talking about this in some or other way. Of course, this has not always been an unmitigatedly positive thing, and it's led to conflicts and issues. For example, in the case of the EU, the decision by the UK to leave, resulting from the vote on Brexit, and a number of other problems and issues as well that we're going to get to throughout the course. Now that we know how these theories are different, how are they a little bit similar? Well, funny you should ask. Realism and liberalism seem very different, and in some ways they are, but they also make a few key assumptions that are similar between the two. One is the role of the state. In realism, this is pretty unambiguous. States are basically billiard balls deflecting off of each other. They're self-contained entities. In liberalism, okay, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but ultimately states are still the center of the system. Organizations like the UN are ultimately collections of states. So this involves acknowledging that states are where the action is. NGOs, labor unions, all these other forces, environmental movements, sure, they're out there, but they're secondary. And both assume that states are everywhere territorially sovereign, which is to say that each state, it has a government that controls its own piece of land and its own piece of territory. Yeah, that isn't really true in the way that people sometimes assume it to be. The United States is a state, Germany is a state, Somalia is a state, but obviously the levels of effective control that governments have over their country as a whole, their level of effective sovereignty, is going to be very, very radically different. Secondly, the role of identity. For realism, identity is secondary to survival. For liberalism, some identity issues matter, but they're a very limited range, in my humble opinion. And what we've seen in recent years has been that the history of LGBTQ rights and women's rights movement, just to pull up two examples, have shown the limits of thinking about identity like this, and have shown the limits, frankly, of both of these bodies of theory, in my opinion. And lastly, the role of inequality. Realism has fairly little to say about inequality because, again, it is secondary to the broader question of anarchy and conflict. Liberalism does, but it really sees inequality within a statist world. And what we've seen in recent years are a bunch of transnational issues that don't really fit in that framework. So, for example, growing stresses over the price of housing and the price of property, which are in multiple countries an ongoing issue, and which neither realism nor liberalism really has a lot to say about, even though they're manifestly global issues, and even though governments in multiple countries struggle to find solutions about what to do about the cost of housing and the cost of living. This is one example, and there are many more. But to me, these are sort of three areas where realism and liberalism, yeah, they're different, but they're similar enough that they kind of exclude a bunch of issues that I think are really interesting to try to understand. Just to wrap up things for today, the state under globalization, as we have seen, realism and liberalism both have a lot to offer in understanding some aspect, some part of globalization. At the same time, by assuming the role of the state, they wind up with somewhat less to say about the many problems and issues in which the state plays a smaller or mitigated role. This includes situations where, for example, states are or think they are helpless in relation to economic turbulence and upheaval. And I can go into a bunch of different examples like this. My argument is that to help encompass these phenomena, in other words, talk about these kinds of tricky issues that don't really fit inside the state system, we need a different set of approaches. And this is where our approaches on world systems, ethics, and cultural irrationality are all going to play a role in thinking about globalization and in thinking through the issues on this course.